Welcome to another video. Today is the 25th of February, and today we're going to be talking about the situation primarily in Bakhmut and its environs, and I'm going to talk about the logistical situation and talking about the possibility of a Ukrainian retreat. But before I get into that, I want to show everybody that I have made some updates to the map. So you can see that I've added in a whole host of new units. I don't actually know the location for all of them. A lot of these are newly formed Ukrainian mechanized units. Some of them are also artillery units, and others are also territorial defense units. So again, it seems like a lot of these are being either moved to the border around Belarus, and some, I presume, will be moved to the border with Russia around Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, not necessarily to Bakhmut, although I've heard a lot of talk from Ukrainian sources that are trying to create some assault units that could assault Crimea in the spring. That's a whole different story, but again, if you're interested, you can look through my map. I have all of these different units that have been added in, and I will add more as time goes on and I do further research in that regard. Now let's get into it. So we all know how there really hasn't been that much pressure applied to Yahidne over the past few weeks. Well, now that's apparently changed. There's reports coming from a whole host of Russian sources, including Military Maps, which has a very good and detailed map of the situation on the front lines from the Russian perspective, of course. But they're usually one of the first sources to make major changes that are usually proven right in the end. So what they're reporting on their map is that the Russian advance has really begun to envelop Yahidne on all sides, and that the line of contact is incredibly close to the town of Yahidne, which implies that there's been some increase in assaults in this direction over the past few days. And this is something that has been echoed by many Ukrainian sources that are saying there's very fierce fighting going on in with the aim of holding on to the town of Yahidne and repulsing the Wagner assaults. So that's the situation in Yahidne. And this is very important for Ukraine holding on to Yahidne because of the wider logistical situation and implications that it would have if the town fell, because of the fact that it is a local logistical hub. When you look at all these roads, I've marked basically all of them, mainly the highway, the minor roads, the gravel and dirt roads, but I'm sure that I missed out on some. But these are the most important roads. I've mapped them out, and you see how a lot of them are linking up in Yahidne and then make their way into Bakhmut. So for that reason alone, Yahidne is very important to hold on to. And after that, there's really not much else for Ukraine to use as a corridor to continue to supply Bakhmut and to maybe later on retreat from the town itself. But let's go on to the city of Bakhmut itself. It is a Berkhivka district where I reported previously on the Russian gains that sort of created a bulge in the line that separated two or maybe even three Ukrainian groupings into different groups. So due to this bulge, the northern and southern groupings in eastern Bakhmut are now basically isolated from one another. They could only really communicate via one road over here, and that's really in an open area. So you'll have the Wagner group or whatever Russian forces are in here stationed in these houses. They may be able to overlook the lower elevated fields where the Ukrainians are going to and from, and they could pretty easily fire upon it. Also, the same thing if the Ukrainians want to cross the Bakhmutovka River to the western side of the city of Bakhmut in some sort of retreat. So that's the issue that the Ukrainians are faced with right now. And so you're seeing this divide and conquer strategy going on, where some of these units that are stationed on the eastern part of Bakhmut may not be able to make it out with the rest of the Ukrainian garrison on the western side in case of a broader collapse. Now let's go to the north, which is where we have the most updates. So over here, we now have full confirmation that the Wagner group was able to take Yahidne, and here we have geolocated footage to show that the Russians are in Yahidne, And here we have a video of the Ukrainians where they're shelling the Wagner Group, although I can't really discern whether there was any casualties on the Wagner Group side. So, as a result of Yahidne being taken, the Ukrainian forces in the Stupka district, which is the northernmost district of Bakhmut, they were sort of isolated and forced to retreat. So Stupka is over here, and really without a fight, the Ukrainians retreated from the southern part of the district, and they retreated across an open field on a lower elevated area into the industrial district of western Bakhmut. So this is where you have a lot of different facilities, factories, government buildings, train stations, large buildings, and I think that it's actually connected via underground tunnel network to this facility over here, which is the meat processing plant in the Miaskombinat district in Bakhmut, in the northeastern part of Bakhmut. So that's part of why we're not seeing any Russian gains in Miaskombinat, because of the extensive underground fortifications and due to the fact that there are some industrial facilities in the area. Now, if we go on and look at the broader situation, the Russians were also able to capture this town over here called Dubovo-Vasilivka. I was anticipating this because Dubovo-Vasilivka was basically isolated following the fall of Berkhivka. The Ukrainians really were enveloped on all sides besides the fields to the southwest. And so the town was also on lower elevation. The Russians had control of a hill that was overlooking it, so they could pretty easily fire upon the Ukrainian positions. So there really was no logic behind staying put over there. So I'm pretty much sure that whatever Ukrainian formations were over there either went to Bogdanivka or to Berkhivka over here. I don't really think they'd want to go to Orikovo-Vasilivka because it's really a similar situation where it's on the same valley. And so whatever formations retreat to there will also be fired upon by the Russians on the same hill. And so you could also see that town being taken in the future if Russia advances that direction pretty easily. Now, let's talk about the implications of Russia's gains over the past few days. So if you look at the yellow markings, there really aren't that many roads left. There are two main roads, the one from Ivanivske, of course, and the one from Hromove. So this is the one from Ivanivske. This is the one in the southern part, the southern flank. This one is incredibly close to the line of contact, and so I highly doubt that it could be used effectively by any sort of large contingent of Ukrainian forces. If there's a large convoy, it will be fired upon using maybe ATGMs. It's probably within the range of some Kornet missile if the Russians are close enough at this point. Also, mortars, obviously, and field artillery. And so you don't really want to send large convoys through the T-0504 road, although in theory it is possible, at least from Ivanivske to Bakhmut. It can't be used to go across the dam, though, because that was blown up either by the Ukrainians or Russians. I'm not exactly sure who did it. But there are some minor roads, maybe gravel roads, dirt roads that go through this forest and then could link up with the dam in the road across the dam and into Chasiv Yar. Then, if we look at Ivanivske, there are some other minor roads that are connecting the town to Bakhmut. These ones are dirt roads. So you have this one, for instance. This one connects Ivanivske to Hromove, and then from there you have two different ways to reach Bakhmut. You have this one to the south, and then you have this other one to the north, which links up to Bakhmut to this specific dam that I'm going to talk about later in the video. Then you have the T-0506 road, which is another major road, the second one that I'm referring to, which connects Chasiv Yar to Hromove and then into Bakhmut itself. So along this path, you have different roads branching out, connecting with other roads. You have one from Bogdanivka. You have one that branches out towards this rail line and then goes full circle and then links up with Bakhmut again. You have this small road that links up with the dam that I was referring to previously. And then you have one going northwards towards the town of Berkhivka that isn't really that important, but it is another way to reach the suburbs of Bakhmut. So again, you have many different paths, and this is not even a full list of roads and dirt roads, because you could still use open fields. There are still paths that are applied through the open fields that could be used in theory. The ground is still frozen in some areas, so you don't even need to have a road to move vehicles, armored vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, tanks, trucks, cars, and other such military equipment. But as we're progressing into 2023, we're seeing the beginning of spring now, and so with that comes spring rain. And so a lot of that ice is going to start to melt, and as a result, we're going to start to see, if there's rain, much more mud in this area, which will make any sort of movement of heavy equipment extremely difficult. And in a high intensity situation where you need to get from point A to point B without any cover in a very fast amount of time, any sort of mud would bog down the retreating force and make them basically sitting ducks for the Russian artillery, which already has an advantage. So that's a very pressing issue for the Ukrainians, and it's part of why they have been trying to hold out for so long at Berkhivka, then in Berkhivka, then Yahidne. Obviously, they were not successful in that regard, but they are still trying to hold out at Hormove, trying to hold the flanks. And then that's also part of why they've been holding on to Ivanivske for so long. Because even though all these roads are within the range of Russian field artillery, it's still physically under their control, which means there's at least some hope of withdrawing the Ukrainian forces in this area. The size of the Ukrainian garrison in Bakhmut, if I had to guess, is over 10,000. And you see the map over here, you see that there are many different brigades and battalions. Not all of them are at full capacity, and many of them are not actually fully in the city itself. Others are on the flanks, so they could get out more easily than the ones that are very deeply entrenched within the city. But either way, there is a huge garrison in here that will be isolated if worst comes to worst. And so that's why the Ukrainians have been moving in reinforcements from elsewhere, other fronts like Zaporozhye, Kherson, the ones that were successful over there, and from Kreminna-Zvatove into the Bakhmut area, and they've been sent to the flanks to try to hold out for as long as possible. And what I suspect will happen is that the Ukrainians will send some of their territorial defense units, the ones that are least experienced, have the least sort of fighting capabilities. They will be sent to the eastern front, you could say, of the front line. And they will try to hold out and prevent any sort of breakthrough within the city itself. And then you'll see some units as well holding the flanks for as long as possible as the best Ukrainian forces within the city retreat. And what are those units, you may ask? Well, you have the 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade, which is a part of the Ukrainian National Guard. Very well-respected unit, very battle-hardened. You would not want to lose those men. 17th Tank Brigade. Again, a very important unit. Let's look for some other ones over here. We have, again, 57th Motorized Brigade, fought in Kherson. They were one of the first units to enter Kherson. They are very battle-hardened, and they're fighting right now on the front line. The Ukrainians may want to withdraw them before it's too late. Let's look for some other ones. You have 71st Jaeger Brigade. Again, this mobile unit that has been a very good fighting force for Ukraine throughout the war. You don't want to lose them either. You have the Georgian Legion, very battle-hardened after many years of fighting in Ukraine. They're all volunteers. And then you have these territorial defense units that would basically serve as the first echelon of the Ukrainian defense, trying to hold out for as long as possible. So one of the tactics used by Ukraine to slow down the Russian advance has been by blowing up dams. This is something they did in Kiev. Actually, I want to show that to everyone. If you remember the Battle of Kiev, the Ukrainians, I think it was on the second day, February 25th, so exactly a year ago, they blew up the dam that was around the town of Vysherod, maybe a bit to the north, and this caused so much flooding in the area around Obolonsky district, and around the town of Moshchun, which was one of the towns that was most contested by the Russians and Ukrainians. And this is the key area where the Russians were trying to break through and attack the Ukrainian defensive line on the outskirts of the city itself. And because there was so much mud, and because there was so much water that was overflowing, that was destroying the bridges and the pontoon bridges that the Russians were trying to set up in Moschun, they were not able to take the town, which means they were never able to go through the forest and assault Kiev itself head on. And so that played a vital role in the course of that battle. So now Ukraine is trying to emulate that on a smaller scale in Bakhmut. Let's zoom in and see the situation over there. So if you see, this is the dam that I'm referring to. It's the one over here. I have a video of the dam being flooded. It was probably the Ukrainians that flooded this, because I don't know if the Russians were physically there. Maybe they shelled it or something. But either way, it would probably cause the Russians more issues, but I will get into why it's not the end of the world for the Russians. So here you have this map by Andrew Perpetua. He deserves a lot of credit for mapping this out, so I'm going to link his map in the description if you're interested. Here you have the flood zone that he mapped out, and this seems pretty accurate based on the topographic map. This is where the water will spread, the flooding will spread. This is the area that will be most affected. You could look. The area where it's the most wide is the floodplain, which is in between the towns of Berkhivka and Pirorodny, and also the Bakhmut Stupka district. So yeah, that's where you could expect to see the most amount of flooding. I'll actually show the topographic map for that. Here you can see the town of Pirorodny, and you can see how this entire floodplain area is only about 250 meters, or feet above sea level. So again, you'll see some flooding over here. For a couple of hours, you'll see perhaps some mud in the area, which will slow down some of Russia's military equipment from being shipped to the front line for the Wagner Group, for instance. But again, let's look at the roads and the supply route. So even if you have this flooding, which affects Berkhivka and Krasnohora, the Russians still control Yahidne, they still control Berkhivka, and so they have roads that lead to the front line on the northern flank. They could just bypass the flooded areas, and that could connect to Yahidne, and then they could continue their assault on Khromoveh unabated. So all in all, just blowing up one dam won't really do anything. There are some other dams in the area. Maybe they'll try to blow those ones up. There's one over here. If the Ukrainians are interested, maybe they'll try to blow this one up. And there are some other reservoirs. There's a pond over here just to the south of Khromoveh, but I don't know if it's dammed up or not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Either way, you do have a lot of small bodies of water in this area. But again, in summary, this is a ticking time bomb in terms of the fall of Bakhmut, and I am really interested to see how Ukraine will conduct this retreat, because conducting an organized retreat of such a large force in such a narrow area would be a major operational feat if it was conducted properly. But I'm just skeptical of that. I would assume that what will end up happening is that the Ukrainians, they'll end up dispersing into small groups, because it's something they did basically in every single other cauldron that was ever formed. Something they did in Solidar, something they did in Krasnohora, something they did in Berkhivka. If you remember, I talked about it a few days ago, something they did in Berkhivka. Every single time that they're enveloped, they just retreat in smaller groups. A lot of the time this is disorganized, and that just leads to the next cauldron. And now we're seeing that happen on a major scale. So there will undoubtedly be chaos. There will undoubtedly be casualties that are incurred by the Ukrainians as they retreat across these roads. But I do not think that there will be massive amounts of POWs taken like in a Mariupol sort of situation. So that's really it for today. I'd like to thank everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.